the validity of the Steele dossier one way or another, like this investigation and whatever it is does not really hinge on that, frankly. But they've certainly zeroed in on that. And now what you're saying, and of course this is, and maybe you could talk about the reauthorization that happened with a FISA court a couple of weeks ago in light of this, but that the Republican rhetoric and the Trump team's rhetoric is that they're identifying and harnessing the rhetoric of civil liberties, the rhetoric of national security state overreach, which is very real, for their own narrow political ends. But then maybe conversely, there's people in the sort of resistance or MIC resistance or whatever we want to call it, who, instead of disaggregating between the Trump team and, broader issues that are legitimate, are just sort of hinging their whole case on a blind faith in institutions that, of course, have abused public trust.
Yeah, well, and it's also just frustrating because, you heard the FBI warning that if this memo were to be released prior to its release, that it would do grave damage to national security. And I think we've gotten very used to, this kind of hyperbolic language from law enforcement, from intelligence agencies in this entire war on terror. And so, when a 3.5 or 4-page memo is actually released, it's pretty obvious. At least I haven't heard a single intelligence analyst or intelligence expert argue that did great damage to national security. And, and Democrats were very much kind of towing that same line, that this shouldn't be released for those purposes. And so then when this document is released, when it's clear that that threat or that risk that they were playing up doesn't actually apply to this document, it also discredits those arguments. And so you're sure there are very real national security threats that we should take seriously. But when you cry wolf about something like this, it makes people less inclined to actually believe it when the government says it. And so you have both Republicans and Democrats for, political convenience using either a national security or a civil liberties argument for kind of a farcical case where neither really apply. And I just think that overall that does a lot of damage to, the credibility of the government and to people's faith in institutions, which already is incredibly low at the moment. And so, if you're talking about the FISA reauthorization that just happened the other week, that was for Section 702, which is intended to collect information and communications on people overseas. But what happens then inadvertently is if they're communicating with somebody in the United States, then that American citizens or American residents' communications are also swept up. And Congress had the ability to put some kind of amendment in. There were people on both sides of the aisle who tried to put up a new law that would have created more protections for Americans' information, but that got voted down. And so ultimately, for 6 more years, FISA and this Section 702 power got reauthorized. Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein, some of the leadership of the Democratic Party all voted for it. And so did Devin Nunes, the guy who wrote the freaking Nunes Memo.
Right.
So it's so obvious that everyone is full of shit that I don't, and it's almost mind-blowing. And that, again, to me is one of the more kind of frustrating aspects of everything that has been going on. And just one more point about that, too, in the FISA reauthorization, because I interviewed some ACLU lawyers about this the other week when it was happening. What happens is they essentially then just put all of that information into their system, and then other agencies like the FBI just search through it in the way that a government lawyer actually himself claimed in front of a FISA court, akin to the way that Americans use Google search.
Yeah.
So that should freak you out.
Yeah.
Or at least,
no, it should absolutely freak you out, and it should also be, I think, put in part of a broader conversation of the administration's war on immigrants, and even setting aside the specific abuse, which is first and foremost with those, with communities that are targeted by these policies. When you start looking at, license plate info being shared across agencies as an example, and hiring private security contractors to help in that process. I mean, you look at these kind of parallel, sort of massive civil liberty abuse and overreaches by government agencies, and then actually parallel sort of like business interests essentially that help carry out these sort of programs and monitoring, and then that becomes another, self-licking ice cream cone and business interest in Washington. And I think, just really underlie that on both sides. And this to me is not, the hypocrisy thing is whatever. I'm totally, hypocrisy is hypocrisy.
We're used to that.
Yeah. I mean, whatever, who cares, right? That's old news. But let's run the parallel here. On one hand, the Trump administration is building a conspiracy theory matrix that does sound like it's out of, Alex Jones. It is actually, in fact, out of Alex Jones and Sean Hannity and comic books. And then at the same time, or sounds like it's from a comic book. Then at the same time, and, you talked about FISA, there's definitely other areas. It's giving policy-wise the national security state everything it wants, including more aggressive kinetic activity overseas with even less regard for civilian casualties than the Obama administration, which is another kind of piece that we could put into play here. And then, as you said before, the sort of resistance figures who, on one hand, it's like Trump is this sort of grossly reckless figure, which of course he is. We still are going to reauthorize all of these unique, massive executive powers, which were expanded under Bush and codified under Obama. So we have this double game going on, and the FISA thing was the perfect example of that, and also hilarious because Trump was, following his own logic and tweeting about, oh, this is really bad, we gotta, and then clearly somebody was like, oh my God, say it's been fixed on Fox, and then he was like, it's been fixed, it's great.
Yeah, that part was very confusing because I think it was within a matter of a couple of hours where he first, tweeted an opposition to the FISA reauthorization, and then clearly got like a call from, Paul Ryan or somebody. And then
probably like Bo Dietl. Forget Paul. Probably like the steak doctor on Fox News.
I mean, ultimately, though, this is, like you said, it's not surprising, but it's depressing. Mm-hmm. Considering where we were just a couple of years ago and what revelations, really came out thanks to Edward Snowden, and the fact that this was, at least for a very brief moment in time, a part of the national discourse and the national debate, and it was, part of the public consciousness. It's unfortunate now that it's just kind of completely been swept under the rug, and people have completely forgotten it again. And I think Democrats are very much responsible for this in a way where if they had wanted to champion these issues, they could have, but they don't want to, and that's ultimately what's at the root of this, is that the area where you always have bipartisan support is on areas of national security. And so, there are some civil libertarians in both parties who do champion these issues, but for the most part, our politicians don't care. For the most part, unfortunately, I think the public, I don't know if it's that they don't care or, there's just other stuff going on, and so you get easily distracted. But, to your point, too, even with, like, the Section 702, the companies, or not only Section 702, but in general, you have so many of these large tech companies, right, Apple, Google, whoever, who are often handing over, to government requests information on their users and their data. And they're not out there vocally lobbying against renewing any of these policies or laws. And so I think that also just kind of shines a light on the way the industry interacts with and cooperates with the government here. And so no one has Americans' privacy rights, in line, unfortunately. But at least for the meantime, we have this kind of very obvious display that no one cares, because if you're so caught up and swept up in wanting to oppose Trump, then, then these kind of other glaring abuses and like we said, hypocrisies on the part of other political leaders like Democrats, are something that people are willing to let go or let slide.
That's true. And I don't, I think it's hard to find a sort of broad, rigorous assessment of the Obama administration, and I hit Obama a lot from the left. I also, I think obviously it's delusional to not admit that, yeah, of course I miss the guy being in office, relatively speaking, to either Trump or Bush. I think that's pretty obvious to almost anybody. But at the same time, I do wonder. I mean, when Bush was doing this stuff, and we were first, and becoming aware of this stuff during Bush, it was terrifying because partially, because you associate it with like, this is an administration that will lie about intelligence findings to facilitate an invasion. This is an administration that's playing with, that's engaging in torture and rendition. So of course, if they're kind of aggressively violating people's civil liberties, that kind of fits with a whole pattern that's very disturbing. And then it wasn't just, I think that it was like that Obama policy-wise obviously codified and continued many of these Bush administration programs and was not in any way, was not protective of our civil liberties, just to put it simply. But maybe the real damage was this culture change where it does seem, and I think partially you're right, there's just so much that people are overwhelmed by, including, it's like, look, hey, maybe the FBI is violating my privacy in some indirect way, but if you're worrying about, housing, healthcare, job, I mean, obviously those things are extremely immediate. But I do think that there was also and this is where you're probably right, we have to focus on Democrats and Obama in particular, because the culture change of saying like, hey, this is a big deal that the NSA has all this data and there's no real governance model, or this is a real big deal that there's an obscure court that pretty much almost always sides, with government requests, and that people are tracking these in kind of just reams of data. It was the Obama brand that I think made it safer, quote unquote, safer in a lot of people's minds. And Trump, even Trump has not changed that, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah, and the truth is, it's always been a thing too, right? Whether before it was being tough on crime, then it turned into being tough on terrorism. Now I guess we're back to being, tough on MS-13 because that's where Donald Trump has decided to direct MS-13. Everyone's attention.
Right.
And and it's always just interesting to me, the kind of cognitive dissonance that people have between what currently is happening, what we're currently willing to accept, and the way that we look at American history. And the way that people obviously welcome any kind of disclosures of CIA documents, et cetera, right, that have not been made public for years. You had all the Kennedy papers that were released last year, or, even looking at the movie like The Post. We lionize these journalists, anybody who was out there fighting against government secrecy in the past. And I don't understand why we can't apply the same thing to what we're currently going through in our current moment.
Like it might be.
And that's why I was just going to, take it back to this dumb waste of time memo debate that we're having at the moment, because that's what I really do think it is. It's a waste of time and a big distraction.
Yes.
Now you have the Democrats that want to release their memo, and people arguing that they shouldn't do it because then that gives them more political capital. And, it's like everything should just be out there. I'm always an advocate for the more transparency, the better, because then we can actually look at the facts and make decisions and judgments based on what we actually see in front of us, instead of allowing people to spin things for political convenience.